When the emergency siren screamed across NATO's Ramstein Air Base and seasoned generals found themselves looking to a 23-year-old European tourist for answers. Nobody could have predicted that the woman they'd dismissed as just another visitor would become the person who saved hundreds of lives. This is the story of how Kris Luna went from taking selfies at the base museum to commanding a crisis response that military veterans still talk about today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ramstein Air Base in Germany as tour groups gathered near the visitor center, their cameras ready and guidebooks in hand. It was supposed to be just another routine civilian appreciation day, one of those carefully orchestrated events where the military opened its doors to local communities and international visitors. Kris Luna adjusted her small backpack and checked her phone for the 100th time. At 23, she stood out among the mostly older German tourists, not just because of her age, but because of the intensity with which she absorbed everything around her. While others snapped quick photos and chatted casually, Kris studied every aircraft, every piece of equipment, every sign with the focused attention of someone genuinely fascinated by what she was seeing. "First time on a military base?" asked Werner, the elderly German tour guide, noticing her concentrated observation. "Actually, no," Kris replied in accented English, her Czech pronunciation giving her words a precise musical quality. "But first time on an active NATO base. It's incredible how organized everything is." What Werner didn't know, what none of the tour participants knew, was that Kris Luna wasn't just any tourist. She was a recent graduate of Prague's University of Economics, where she'd specialized in crisis management and logistics coordination. More importantly, she'd spent the last 2 years volunteering with European disaster relief organizations, coordinating evacuations during the devastating floods that had swept through Central Europe. But to everyone at Ramstein, she was simply tourist number 47 on the day's roster, someone who'd signed up for the base appreciation tour during her backpacking trip through Germany. Her name was written in neat handwriting on a visitor badge that hung around her neck, marking her as definitively outside the military world that hummed around them. The tour began at 10 a.m. sharp, led by Staff Sergeant Michelle Brooks, a professional and patient guide who'd given this same presentation hundreds of times. "Welcome to Ramstein Air Base, home to the 86th Airlift Wing and one of the largest American military communities outside the United States," Brooks announced to the group of 32 civilians. Kris positioned herself near the middle of the pre-phone group, close enough to hear everything, but not so close as to appear overeager. She'd learned from her disaster relief work that the best way to understand any operation was to observe quietly first, ask questions second. As they walked through the base, she noticed details that others missed: the positioning of emergency equipment, the flow patterns of personnel, the strategic placement of communication systems. The base serves as a crucial logistics hub for NATO operations, Brooks continued, leading them past a series of massive aircraft. "We coordinate humanitarian missions, military transport, and emergency response throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East." While other tourists focused on the impressive planes and took selfies, Kris found herself studying the ground crew operations, the loading procedures, the obvious efficiency of the entire system. She'd seen similar coordination during disaster responses, but never at this scale or with this level of precision. "Ma'am, you have a lot of questions," Brooks observed good-naturedly as they paused near the air traffic control tower. It was true, Kris had been asking detailed questions about everything from fuel logistics to communication protocols. "Sorry," Kris laughed, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I work in emergency management back home. This is all fascinating to me." "Emergency management?" Brooks looked interested. "Like what kind?" "Disaster relief coordination. Floods, mostly." We help coordinate evacuations and resource distribution. Kris kept her answer brief, not wanting to monopolize the tour guide's attention or make the other tourists uncomfortable. What she didn't mention was the scope of her experience. In just 2 years, she'd helped coordinate the evacuation of over 15,000 people from flood zones across 3 countries. She'd worked 18-hour days in makeshift command centers, had learned to speak the language of emergency response, and had developed an intuitive understanding of how to move people and resources quickly under pressure. But here at Ramstein, surrounded by career military professionals, that experience seemed almost trivial. She was just a young woman with a backpack and a visitor badge, someone who'd paid 15 euros to see how a real military operation functioned. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent months planning this trip, had specifically requested to visit Ramstein because of its reputation as a humanitarian logistics hub. She'd hoped to learn something that might help her in her own work, maybe gain some insights into large-scale emergency coordination. Instead, she found herself relegated to the role of curious tourist, asking polite questions and trying not to seem too interested in the operational details that genuinely fascinated her. It was a familiar feeling being underestimated because of her age, her appearance, her status as an outsider. As the morning progressed and the tour continued through various facilities, Kris continued to observe, to learn, to file away information that might someday prove useful. She had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, every bit of knowledge she was gaining, every detail she was absorbing, would become absolutely crucial. The sunny morning stretched ahead, peaceful and routine, with nothing to suggest that this ordinary base tour was about to become something extraordinary. While the tour group moved through the base cafeteria for their scheduled lunch break, Kris found herself gravitating toward a wall display that most visitors barely glanced at. The emergency response protocols chart was comprehensive, detailing everything from medical emergencies to natural disasters to security threats. She studied it with the same intensity that others reserve for the impressive aircraft displays. "That's quite comprehensive," she murmured to herself, photographing the chart with her phone, not for social media, but for reference. Her disaster relief background made her appreciate the thoroughness of the planning, though she noticed some gaps that European protocols typically address differently. Staff Sergeant Brooks appeared beside her. "Most people find that pretty boring compared to the jets." "Actually, it's fascinating," Kris replied, pointing to a section about mass casualty procedures. "We use a similar triage system in civilian disaster response, but your evacuation flow patterns are much more sophisticated. The way you've integrated air and ground transport." She trailed off, realizing she was probably revealing more expertise than a typical tourist should have. Brooks studied her more carefully. "You said you work in emergency management?" "Volunteer work, mostly," Kris deflected, though that was only partially true. Her volunteer position had evolved into a consulting role with the Czech Emergency Management Agency, and she'd recently been invited to join a European Union task force on cross-border disaster coordination. But explaining that seemed unnecessarily complicated. What Brooks couldn't see was the small notebook in Kris's backpack, filled with detailed observations from her morning on base. While other tourists had been taking selfies, Kris had been unconsciously mapping the facility layout, noting the locations of emergency equipment, identifying potential bottlenecks in evacuation routes, and observing the communication patterns between different units. It was a habit she developed during her disaster relief work. Her supervisor, Dr. František Novak, had taught her that effective emergency coordination required understanding systems before you needed to use them. Crisis management, he'd told her repeatedly, is about preparation meeting opportunity. During her university studies, Kris had specialized in what academics called adaptive logistics, the ability to rapidly reconfigure resource distribution and personnel deployment in response to changing emergency conditions. It was theoretical, knowledge that had become practical experience during the floods that devastated Central Europe 2 summers ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd been just a student volunteer then, assigned to help coordinate supply distribution to evacuation centers. But when the regional coordinator suffered a heart attack during the height of the crisis, Kris had found herself temporarily managing the logistics for 12,000 evacuees across 4 temporary shelters. She'd worked for 64 hours straight, coordinating everything from food delivery to medical supply distribution to transportation scheduling. The experience had changed her. Not just because she'd discovered she was good at emergency coordination, but because she'd learned that effective crisis management often required someone to step outside their assigned role and take responsibility for the bigger picture. Since then, she'd trained extensively in multi-agency coordination, had learned to speak 4 languages fluently to better communicate during international relief efforts, and had developed what her colleagues called an intuitive understanding of how to move large numbers of people safely and efficiently. But none of that was evident to the Ramstein personnel who saw her as tourist number 47. To them, she was just another young European taking a base tour, probably more interested in Instagram photos than emergency procedures. As the group finished lunch and prepared to continue their tour, Kris noticed increased activity around them. Personnel were moving with slightly more urgency, and she caught fragments of radio communications that suggested some kind of developing situation. Her disaster relief instincts kicked in. She'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated a shift from routine to potential emergency. "Is everything all right?" she asked Brooks quietly. "Just normal operations," Brooks replied. But Kris noticed the guide checking her radio more frequently and glancing toward the command areas with what looked like mild concern. The afternoon portion of the tour was supposed to include a visit to the Logistics Coordination Center, something Kris had been particularly looking forward to. But as they approached the facility, she could see increased activity inside, personnel moving rapidly between workstations, multiple screens displaying what appeared to be tracking information, and supervisors engaged in intense discussions. "Actually," Brooks announced to the group, "we're going to skip the logistics center today and move directly to the aircraft maintenance facilities." Disappointed murmurs arose from the group, but Kris felt something different, a growing certainty that whatever was developing wasn't just normal operations. Her experience had taught her to recognize the early stages of emergency coordination, and everything she was observing suggested that Ramstein Air Base was beginning to shift into crisis response mode. She found herself automatically cataloging resources she'd observed during the morning tour: available aircraft, personnel levels, communication capabilities, logistical assets. It was an unconscious process, her mind organizing information the way it always did when emergency situations began to develop. But she was still just a tourist, walking through a military installation with a visitor badge and a backpack, completely outside the chain of command and protocols that were beginning to activate around her. The irony was that she probably understood emergency coordination better than many of the base personnel, but there was no way for anyone to know that. As the afternoon progressed, Kris continued to observe, to learn, and to unconsciously prepare for something she couldn't yet define. Her hidden expertise remained invisible to everyone around her, but it was there, ready to emerge when the moment demanded it. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. By 2 p.m., it was becoming impossible to ignore the increased activity throughout the base. Military personnel moved with purposeful urgency. Radios crackled with constant communication, and Kris noticed several tour areas being quietly cordoned off. The cheerful, welcoming atmosphere of the morning had shifted into something more focused and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen," Staff Sergeant Brooks announced to the tour group as they stood outside the aircraft maintenance hangar, "We're going to need to modify our afternoon schedule slightly. Some areas we plan to visit are temporarily unavailable due to operational requirements. The tourists murmured among themselves with mild disappointment, but Kris felt her pulse quicken. In her disaster relief experience, operational requirements was often code for an emerging emergency situation. She watched as personnel around them received what appeared to be briefings, their expressions growing more serious with each passing conversation. "Excuse me," Kris approached Brooks during a brief break in the tour. "Is there anything we can do to help? If there's an emergency developing, I have experience in—" "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern," Brooks interrupted politely but firmly, "but this is a military installation with established protocols. The best way civilians can help is by following the tour schedule and staying in designated areas." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Kris found herself categorized immediately: civilian, tourist, outsider. Someone to be managed and contained, not someone who might contribute. It was a familiar frustration that she'd experienced in various emergency situations, being judged by appearance and status rather than capability. As the tour continued, Kris noticed other small indicators of crisis escalation. Ground crews were prepping aircraft with unusual urgency. Communications personnel were establishing additional workstations. Most tellingly, she observed medical personnel conducting what appeared to be equipment checks and briefings. During a stop at the base chapel, Kris overheard a conversation between two airmen that made her blood run cold. "How many are we talking about?" one asked quietly. "Latest reports say maybe 800 people, but the numbers keep changing," his colleague replied. Chemical plant explosion in Poland. Toxic clouds spreading faster than initial projections. Chemical emergency. Mass casualties, international crisis. Everything Kris had trained for, everything she'd coordinated during her disaster relief work, was unfolding just kilometers away. And she was trapped in a tour group, treated as someone who needed to be kept safely away from the real work. She approached Brooks again, this time more directly. "Sergeant, I know this isn't typical protocol, but I have extensive experience in mass casualty coordination. If you're dealing with the chemical incident in Poland, I've worked similar scenarios." "Ma'am," Brooks's voice was strained with the pressure of managing both the tour and the developing crisis. "I need you to understand that this is a military operation. We have trained personnel and established procedures. The most helpful thing you can do is remain with the tour group and follow instructions." Around them, Kris could see the base transforming into crisis response mode. Additional personnel were arriving, emergency equipment was being deployed, and she caught glimpses of coordination activities that she recognized from her own emergency management experience. But she remained firmly categorized as a liability to be managed, not an asset to be utilized. The other tourists seemed oblivious to the growing tension, focused on their cameras and guidebooks. But Kris found herself automatically cataloging resources and analyzing logistics patterns, her mind working through evacuation scenarios and coordination challenges, even as she was systematically excluded from any actual involvement. "This is ridiculous," muttered Hans, an older German tourist, as their planned visit to the air traffic control tower was canceled. "We paid for the full tour." Kris said nothing, but her frustration was building for entirely different reasons. She could see personnel struggling with coordination challenges that she'd faced before, could identify potential bottlenecks in their response planning, could offer insights from her experience with similar mass casualty events. But her visitor badge marked her as someone to be protected from the crisis, not someone who might help solve it. The systematic dismissal continued throughout the afternoon. Every attempt to offer assistance was met with polite but firm rejection. Every display of knowledge about emergency procedures was treated as curious tourist interest rather than professional expertise. She was being managed, contained, and kept safely away from the real work of crisis response. As afternoon shadows grew longer and the base's emergency preparations intensified. Kris remained trapped in her role as tourist number 47, watching from the outside as a crisis unfolded that she was uniquely qualified to help address. The irony was painful. She was probably better trained in mass casualty coordination than many of the personnel working the response, but there was no mechanism for anyone to recognize or utilize that expertise. The dismissal wasn't malicious. It was systematic, institutional, and based on reasonable assumptions about civilian capabilities. But it was also wrong, and with each passing hour, Kris felt more frustrated watching resources being deployed in patterns she could improve, if only someone would listen. At 3:47 p.m., the emergency sirens began to wail across Ramstein Air Base. The sound cut through the afternoon air like a knife, immediately transforming the controlled urgency that had been building throughout the day into something far more serious. Kris had heard emergency sirens before during flood responses, but the sound at Ramstein carried a different weight, deeper, more insistent, designed to mobilize an entire military installation. "All personnel to emergency stations," announced a voice over the base-wide communication system. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. All tour groups report to designated safe areas immediately." Brooks moved with practiced efficiency, her radio crackling with rapid instructions. "Follow me quickly," she called to the tourists, leading them toward what appeared to be a reinforced building marked as a visitor emergency shelter. But as they hurried across the tarmac, Kris could see the scope of what was unfolding around them. Aircraft were being prepped for immediate deployment. Medical personnel were establishing triage areas. Most significantly, she could see convoy vehicles being loaded with what appeared to be decontamination equipment. This wasn't just a chemical plant explosion, it was a mass evacuation scenario involving potential toxic exposure. Inside the emergency shelter, Brooks received a more detailed briefing via radio. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she listened to the updates. When she addressed the tour group, her voice was professional but tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's been a serious industrial accident in Krakow, Poland. A chemical processing facility has exploded, and toxic gases are spreading across a populated area. Ramstein is coordinating the international emergency response, including medical evacuation and decontamination operations." The numbers that followed made Kris's heart race. Estimated 1,200 people requiring immediate evacuation, 300 with potential toxic exposure, unknown casualties, and a toxic plume that continued to expand. It was exactly the type of mass casualty, cross-border emergency scenario that she'd trained for, but on a scale that dwarfed anything she'd previously experienced. "The Polish government has requested immediate NATO assistance," Brooks continued. "We're coordinating with German, Czech, and Slovak emergency services to establish evacuation corridors and medical treatment facilities." Czech services. Kris felt a jolt of recognition. She knew the Czech emergency management protocols, had worked with several of the key coordinators, understood their resource limitations and operational procedures. She was probably the only person in this shelter who understood how the Czech system would interface with NATO coordination. Through the shelter's small windows, she could see the controlled chaos of emergency deployment. Aircraft were taking off at regular intervals, their cargo bays loaded with emergency equipment. Ground crews worked with mechanical precision, but even from her limited vantage point, Kris could identify potential bottlenecks in their logistics flow. "How long until we can leave?" asked Werner, the elderly German tourist, his voice tight with anxiety. "Unknown at this time," Brooks replied honestly. "Base security protocols require all civilians to remain in safe areas until the emergency phase passes. It could be several hours. Several hours of watching from the sidelines while a crisis unfolded that she was uniquely qualified to help address." Kris found herself automatically analyzing what she could observe: aircraft deployment patterns, personnel flow, Coordination challenges that were becoming visible even from the emergency shelter. The radio chatter that Brooks was monitoring painted a picture of escalating complexity. Language barriers were creating communication delays between Polish, German, and Czech emergency services. Evacuation route coordination was proving more complicated than initially anticipated. Most critically, the medical triage protocols being established weren't optimally configured for the specific type of chemical exposure involved. Kris recognized the signs immediately. She'd seen similar coordination challenges during the Central European floods, where multiple national emergency systems had to work together under time pressure. The solutions existed, but they required someone who understood how different national systems operated and could translate between their different protocols and procedures. She stood up, her decision crystallizing. "Sergeant Brooks, I need to speak with whoever's coordinating the Czech interface." "Ma'am, I've already told you. The Czech emergency management system uses different triage protocols for chemical exposure." Kris interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. "Their evacuation procedures prioritize differently than German or American systems. If you're trying to coordinate cross-border medical transport without understanding those differences, people are going to die." Brooks paused, studying Kris with new attention. "What exactly is your background?" "I'm a consultant with the Czech Emergency Management Agency. I've coordinated mass evacuations across 3 countries. And right now, I'm probably the only person on this base who understands how to interface Czech emergency protocols with NATO coordination procedures." For the first time since the Sirens had started, Brooks looked uncertain. Around them, the other tourists watched with growing fascination as the young woman they'd dismissed as just another sightseer revealed expertise that suddenly seemed crucial to the unfolding crisis. Outside, aircraft continued to take off, carrying emergency responders toward a disaster that was growing more complex by the hour. Time was running out, and traditional command structures were struggling with coordination challenges that Kris had been trained specifically to solve. The moment of truth was approaching. Would her expertise finally be recognized, or would she remain trapped in the role of tourist number 47 while preventable mistakes cost lives in Poland? Kris stood in the emergency shelter, her heart racing as she watched Staff Sergeant Brooks wrestle with a decision that could change everything. Through the radio chatter, the scope of the crisis was becoming clearer with each passing minute. The chemical plant explosion in Krakow had created a toxic cloud that was spreading faster than initial projections, and the international response was struggling with coordination challenges that Kris recognized immediately. "The Czech teams are requesting priority evacuation for pediatric cases," Brooks read from her radio updates, "but they're using different medical coding systems than our triage protocols. The medical coordinators are trying to establish compatibility matrices, but it's creating delays in the evacuation queue." Kris felt a surge of recognition. This was exactly the type of problem she'd helped solve during the floods, when Czech, Slovak, and Austrian emergency systems had to coordinate evacuations across national borders. Each country had different protocols, different priority systems, different ways of categorizing casualties. "They're using the EUCBRN classification system," Kris said quietly, stepping closer to Brooks. "Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear exposure categories. The pediatric cases they're requesting priority for aren't just children, they're cases involving specific toxic exposure patterns that require specialized transport protocols." Brooks looked at her sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because I helped establish the interface protocols between Czech and Austrian systems during the flood evacuations 2 years ago," Kris replied. "The Czech teams aren't just being difficult, they're following EU chemical exposure guidelines that prioritize differently than NATO medical protocols. If you try to force them into standard triage categories, you'll miss critical cases that need immediate specialized treatment." Around them, The other tourists watched in fascination as the conversation grew increasingly technical. Werner, the elderly German tourist, leaned forward with obvious interest. "You really know this stuff," he murmured through the radio. Brooks received another update that made her expression even more grim. German medical facilities are reporting capacity issues. The Czech government is requesting establishment of temporary treatment facilities, but there's confusion about decontamination protocols between different national systems. Kris felt her expertise crystallizing into urgent necessity. The Germans use chlorine-based decontamination for industrial chemical exposure. The Czechs use a different system based on EU guidelines that's more effective for this specific type of petrochemical contamination. If you mix the protocols, you could actually make the toxic effects worse. "Jesus," Brooks muttered, looking at her radio as more complications streamed through. "And you know this how?" "Because I spent 6 months working with a EU task force on cross-border chemical emergency response," Kris replied. "We developed interface protocols specifically for situations like this, when different national emergency systems have to coordinate rapid response to toxic contamination events." The radio crackled with increasing urgency. Polish emergency services were reporting that evacuation routes were becoming congested because different national response teams were using incompatible coordination systems. Medical transport aircraft were being delayed because of confusion over patient classification protocols. Most critically, the toxic plume was expanding toward populated areas faster than the evacuation could proceed. Kris found herself automatically visualizing solutions. She knew the Czech emergency management personnel understood their resource limitations and operational procedures. She'd worked with German disaster relief coordination during joint exercises. Most importantly, she'd helped develop the specific protocols designed to address exactly these types of cross-border coordination challenges. "Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying new confidence, "I need you to understand something. Those coordination problems you're hearing about aren't just bureaucratic delays. They're going to cost lives. The Czech teams have experience with this type of chemical contamination from previous industrial accidents. The German medical facilities have capacity, but they need to modify their protocols. And the NATO coordination system needs someone who understands how to interface between all three systems." Brooks studied her with growing realization. "You're saying you could solve these coordination problems?" "I'm saying I've solved these exact coordination problems before," Kris replied. "During the Central European floods, we had to evacuate 15,000 people across 3 national borders using incompatible emergency management systems. I helped develop the interface protocols that made it work. Through the windows, they could see increased activity as more aircraft prepared for deployment. But Kris could also see signs of the coordination difficulties that were developing: ground crews waiting for clearances that were delayed by communication problems, medical personnel establishing procedures that weren't optimized for the specific crisis they were facing. "The thing is," Kris continued, her voice growing more urgent, "these aren't problems that can be solved by throwing more resources at them. They need someone who understands how the different systems work, who can translate between different protocols, who knows the people involved in the coordination chain." She pulled out her phone, showing Brooks her contact list. Names and numbers for emergency coordinators across 3 countries, people she'd worked with during previous international disaster responses. Dr. František Novak in Prague, her supervisor. At the Czech Emergency Management Agency, Colonel Schmidt from German Disaster Relief Coordination. Maria Kowalski from the Polish Emergency Management Center. I could have direct communication established between the key coordinators in 15 minutes, Kris said. I could help them establish compatible evacuation protocols, coordinate the medical transport priorities, and interface the decontamination procedures. But only if someone recognizes that a tourist with a visitor badge might actually know something useful about emergency coordination. Brooks looked at her radio then, at Kris, then at the increasingly complex crisis unfolding around them. For the first time since the Sirens had started, someone in authority was beginning to realize that the expertise they desperately needed might be standing right in front of them, wearing a visitor badge and carrying a tourist's backpack. The question was whether institutional protocols could adapt quickly, enough to recognize and utilize that expertise before the coordination failures cost lives in Poland. Brooks stared at Kris for a long moment, her radio crackling with increasingly urgent updates about coordination failures across the multinational response effort. Polish emergency services were reporting communication breakdowns with German medical facilities. Czech evacuation teams were expressing frustration with NATO transport protocols that didn't align with EU chemical exposure guidelines. Aircraft were sitting on runways waiting for clearances that were delayed by bureaucratic confusion. Then, Brooks shook her head firmly. "Ma'am, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is a NATO military operation coordinating with national emergency services. We have established protocols, trained personnel, and direct communication channels with all relevant agencies." "What we don't have is authorization to involve civilians in operational coordination, regardless of their claimed expertise." The dismissal hit Kris like a physical blow. She could see the solutions to the coordination problems that were developing, could visualize exactly how to interface the different national emergency systems, knew personally many of the key coordinators who were struggling to establish compatible procedures. But her visitor badge and tourist status made her invisible to the military mindset that prioritized credentials over capability. "Sergeant, you're not understanding," Kris began. "No, ma'am, you're not understanding," Brooks interrupted her, voice growing firmer. "This base has trained emergency coordinators, established communication protocols, and direct lines to military and civilian agencies across Europe. We don't need a tourist, however well-meaning, trying to insert herself into professional emergency response operations." Around them, the other tourists watched the exchange with growing fascination. Hans, the elderly German, seemed particularly interested in the technical discussion, but Werner looked uncomfortable with the tension that was building. Through the radio, they could hear Major Patricia Coleman from the Base Emergency Coordination Center providing updates that made Kris's frustration even more acute. "We're experiencing delays in medical transport coordination due to classification protocol incompatibilities between Czech and German systems," Coleman's voice crackled through the speaker. "Polish evacuation routes are experiencing bottlenecks due to coordination confusion between national emergency services. Estimated delay in critical care transport, 45 minutes and increasing. 45 minutes. Kris knew from her experience that chemical exposure casualties had narrow windows for effective treatment. Every minute of delay in proper medical transport could mean the difference between full recovery and permanent disability, or worse. "Please," Kris said, her voice tight with controlled urgency, "just let me make one phone call to Dr. František Novak in Prague. He's the senior coordinator for Czech emergency management. I can establish direct communication between your coordination center and Czech services in 5 minutes. "Absolutely not," Brooks replied. "Military communication protocols don't involve random civilians making unsecured phone calls to foreign government agencies during active emergency operations. Even if your claimed expertise is legitimate, we can't risk communication security breaches during a crisis." The systematic rejection continued as the crisis escalated around them. Each update to the radio brought news of new coordination difficulties, each delay meant more people trapped in the expanding toxic zone, and each protocol-based dismissal of her expertise meant preventable problems were multiplying. "Look," Brooks continued, her tone becoming almost sympathetic, "I understand you want to help. But emergency coordination involves trained military and civilian professionals who understand security protocols, communication procedures, and operational chains of command. Even if you have some background in emergency management, this is a multinational NATO operation with complexity levels that require years of specific training. Kris felt the familiar burn of being categorized and dismissed based on appearance and presumed status rather than actual capability. She was 23, female, carrying a tourist backpack and wearing a visitor badge. To the military mindset, those factors automatically disqualified her from being taken seriously, regardless of her actual expertise or experience. The Czech emergency management coordinator you need to talk to is probably Dr. Novak, Kris said desperately. He's dealt with cross-border chemical incidents before. The German coordinator who understands NATO interface protocols is Colonel Schmidt. The Polish center coordinator who can establish priority evacuation routes is Maria Kowalski. I have direct phone numbers for all of them. Ma'am, Brooks said with strained patience, military emergency coordination operates through established channels. We don't coordinate international emergency response through personal phone calls made by tourists, regardless of who they claim to know. Through the window, Kris could see more aircraft being delayed on the runway, their crews waiting for clearances that were held up by the exact coordination problems she'd been trained to solve. Ground support equipment sat unused because different national systems couldn't agree on compatible operational procedures. Medical personnel prepared treatment facilities using protocols that weren't optimized for the specific chemical exposures they'd be treating. The radio brought another update from Major Coleman. Czech services are requesting modification of transport priorities based on their chemical exposure classification system. German medical facilities need clarification of decontamination protocols. Polish evacuation coordinators are reporting route capacity problems due to protocol incompatibilities, requesting additional coordination resources. Additional coordination resources. The solution they needed was standing in their emergency shelter, wearing a visitor badge and being systematically dismissed because she didn't fit their institutional assumptions about who could provide expertise during a crisis. Brooks looked at her watch, then at the radio bringing continuous updates about escalating coordination failures. Ma'am, the most helpful thing you can do right now is remain calm and follow emergency shelter protocols. Professional emergency coordinators are handling this situation. But Kris could hear in every radio update that the professional coordinators were struggling with problems she'd been specifically trained to solve. Time was running out, and institutional protocol was preventing the utilization of expertise that could save lives. The rejection was complete, systematic, and based on reasonable institutional assumptions. It was also wrong, and people in Poland were going to suffer because of it. At 4:23 p.m., as the radio brought another update about evacuation delays that could have been prevented with proper coordination, Kris Luna made a decision that would change everything. She waited until Brooks was deeply engaged in a complex radio communication about aircraft deployment schedules, then quietly slipped toward the emergency shelter's bathroom area. The other tourists were focused on their phones, trying to contact worried family members about their extended stay on the base. Nobody noticed as she moved past them toward the facility's rear exit. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed open the emergency exit door. The alarm system had been disabled during the crisis deployment, and she stepped out into the controlled chaos of Ramstein's emergency response operation. Aircraft engines roared overhead. Ground crews shouted instructions across the tarmac, and personnel moved with focused urgency between command facilities. This was it. The moment where she crossed from frustrated observer to active participant. From tourist number 47 to someone taking direct action to save lives. There was no going back from this decision. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Dr. František Novak's direct number. Her hands were steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. As the phone rang, she watched emergency personnel around her struggling with coordination challenges she'd been specifically trained to solve. "František Novak," came the familiar voice, tense with crisis management stress. "Dr. Novak, this is Kris Luna. I'm at Ramstein Air Base. I know about the Krakow situation, and I need you to listen carefully." There was a pause. "Kris? What are you doing at Ramstein? Are you involved in the response coordination?" "Not officially," she replied, walking quickly toward what she'd identified earlier as the base communication center. "But I can see the coordination problems developing, and I think I can help establish better interface protocols between Czech services and NATO coordination." "The situation is complex," Novak replied, his voice carrying the strain of managing a multinational emergency response. "We're having difficulty establishing compatible priorities with German medical facilities. The NATO coordination system doesn't align well with our EU chemical exposure protocols." "I know," Kris said, her confidence growing. "That's exactly why I'm calling. I can help establish direct communication channels and translate between the different protocol systems. But I need you to trust me and be ready to coordinate through unofficial channels." She'd reached the communications facility and could see through windows the organized chaos inside. Multiple workstations displayed coordination information, personnel, managed communication links to various agencies, and supervisors tried to resolve the mounting coordination complications that were delaying crucial response efforts. "Kris, if you're not officially involved in NATO coordination, how can you establish interface protocols?" Novak asked. "Because I'm going to make myself officially involved," she replied, studying the building's entry points and security arrangements. Her disaster relief experience had taught her that sometimes effective crisis management required bypassing normal procedures. The communication center had standard base security, but the emergency situation had created enough controlled chaos that additional personnel moving between facilities wouldn't be immediately questioned. Her visitor badge would be problematic, but she'd noticed earlier that emergency response personnel were wearing various types of identification badges and temporary credentials. "František, I need you to do something for me," she continued. "Contact Colonel Schmidt at German Emergency Coordination and Maria Kowalski at the Polish Center. Tell them that unofficial coordination channels are being established through Ramstein to address the protocol compatibility issues. Give them this number as a direct contact for real-time coordination." "Kris, what exactly are you planning?" She took a deep breath, looking at the communications facility where the solutions to preventable coordination failures waited to be implemented. "I'm planning to prove that expertise matters more than credentials, and that sometimes saving lives requires ignoring the people who tell you it's impossible." Around her, the base continued its emergency response operations, but she could see the delays and inefficiencies that were developing due to coordination problems. Aircraft sat on runways waiting for clearances. Medical personnel prepared facilities using non-optimal protocols. Ground support equipment remained underutilized because different national systems couldn't establish compatible procedures. "Dr. Novak, people are going to die because of coordination failures that we know how to prevent," she said quietly. "I can't stand on the sidelines watching that happen when I have the knowledge and contacts to fix it. The risk to your career, to your security clearance applications, to your future in emergency management, double quotes Novak's voice carried genuine concern. "The risk to my conscience if I don't try," Kris replied. "I've spent 2 years learning how to coordinate international emergency response. This is exactly the situation I've been preparing for." She ended the call and approached the communication center, her mind clear about what she needed to do. The emergency response operation around her was struggling with solvable problems, and she had both the expertise and the contacts necessary to solve them. Her visitor badge marked her as someone who shouldn't be here, someone who didn't belong in the professional crisis response operation. But her knowledge, experience, and determination were about to prove that belonging wasn't about badges or official status stat. It was about being prepared to act when lives were at stake, regardless of what other people thought was possible or appropriate. Kris Luna, tourist number 47, was about to become something else entirely. She walked toward the communication center entrance, knowing that she was about to cross a line that would change everything about how she was perceived and what she was capable of accomplishing. The moment of transformation was beginning. Kris approached the communications center with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. Her disaster relief experience had taught her that in crisis situations, people responded to authority and purpose more than credentials. She pulled her visitor badge around to her back and walked directly toward the facility's main entrance. "Excuse me," called a security guard as she approached. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area during emergency operations." "Kris Luna, Emergency Coordination Specialist," she replied without slowing down, holding up her phone as if it were official identification. "I'm here to establish interface protocols between Czech Emergency Services and NATO. Coordination. Dr. František Novak from Prague Emergency Management is expecting my call within the next 5 minutes." The combination of confidence, technical language, and specific details created exactly the effect she'd hoped for. The guard looked uncertain, clearly aware that coordination specialists might need to access the facility during an international emergency, but unsure about proper procedures for validating her authority. "I don't have you on the authorized personnel list," he said, checking his clipboard, "because I'm operating under emergency protocols established directly between Czech Emergency Management and NATO coordination." Kris replied, her voice carrying the professional authority she'd developed during previous crisis responses. "The coordination failures we're experiencing require immediate establishment of direct communication channels." Her phone rang, and she answered it with practiced professionalism. "Kris Luna, Emergency Coordination." "Yes, Dr. Novak, I'm at the communications facility now. We need to establish priority channels immediately." It was actually a spam call, but the timing was perfect. The guard heard her end of what sounded like official emergency coordination business and stepped aside uncertainly. "5 minutes," he said. "But you need to check in with facility security once you're inside." "Understood," Kris replied, walking into the communications center with her heart racing but her expression calm and professional. The facility was exactly what she'd expected from her disaster relief experience. Multiple workstations managing communication links to various agencies, large displays showing coordination information, and supervisors moving between stations trying to resolve mounting problems. The controlled chaos was familiar, but the scale was larger than anything she'd worked with before. She identified the key coordination station immediately, the workstation with the most active communication links, and the supervisor who was clearly managing interface protocols with multiple agencies. Major Patricia Coleman stood at the center of the operation, her expression showing the strain of dealing with coordination complications that were creating dangerous delays. "Major Coleman," Kris approached confidently. "I'm Kris Luna, Emergency Coordination Specialist. Dr. František Novak from Czech Emergency Management asked me to establish direct interface protocols to address the compatibility issues you're experiencing with EU chemical exposure classification systems." Coleman looked up sharply. "I don't have any coordination specialists scheduled to, because the coordination failures are developing faster than formal authorization procedures can accommodate." Kris interrupted smoothly. "Dr. Novak has direct contact information for Colonel Schmidt at German Emergency Coordination and Maria Kowalski at the Polish Center. They're standing by to establish real-time compatibility protocols, but they need direct communication channels that bypass the bureaucratic delays." She pulled out her phone and showed Coleman her contact list names and direct numbers for emergency coordinators across 3 countries, people she'd worked with during previous international disaster responses. These are direct lines to the senior coordinators who can authorize modified protocols immediately, Kris continued. Dr. Novak confirms that Czech services can modify their evacuation priorities to align with NATO transport capabilities, but only if we can establish direct coordination channels that avoid the formal authorization delays. Coleman studied the phone contacts with growing interest. The names and agencies were legitimate, and the specific technical knowledge Kris was displaying about coordination protocol compatibility suggested expertise that could address the mounting problems. The Czech evacuation teams are using EUCBRN classification for chemical exposure priorities, Kris continued, demonstrating her understanding of the specific issues. German medical facilities are prepared to modify their decontamination protocols, but they need direct confirmation of the specific chemical compounds involved. Polish evacuation coordinators can optimize route capacity, but only if they can establish real-time communication with NATO transport scheduling. Around them, the communication center continued managing the crisis response, but Kris could see workstation operators struggling with exactly the coordination challenges she was describing. Translation delays between different protocol systems, authorization bottlenecks between national agencies, and compatibility issues that were creating dangerous delays in medical transport and evacuation procedures. You're saying you can establish direct communication channels that bypass these authorization delays? Coleman asked, her tone shifting from skeptical to genuinely interested. I'm saying I have the contacts and expertise to establish those channels within 15 minutes, Kris replied. But only if you're willing to work with someone who's operating under emergency protocols rather than formal authorization procedures. Coleman looked at her workstation displays showing mounting coordination delays, then at Kris with her unofficial status but obvious technical expertise. The decision she was contemplating involved trusting someone without proper credentials to manage critical communication links during an international emergency. But the alternative was watching coordination failures continue to develop while people in Poland waited for medical transport that was delayed by solvable bureaucratic problems. What do you need? Coleman asked. Kris felt a surge of relief and determination. Finally, someone was willing to prioritize capability over credentials, solutions over procedures. A workstation with secure communication capabilities and authorization to establish direct contact with Czech, German, and Polish emergency coordination centers, she replied. And 15 minutes to prove that expertise matters more than official authorization. Coleman gestured toward an available workstation. You've got it. But if this doesn't work, it will work, Kris said confidently, settling into the chair and beginning to establish the communication links that would prove her worth. Because this is exactly what I've been preparing for. Her preparation was about to meet opportunity in the most dramatic way possible. At 4:51 p.m., Kris Luna sat at a NATO communications workstation with secure lines to 3 countries, her hands steady on the keyboard, despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Major Coleman stood behind her, along with several other coordination personnel who'd gathered to observe what would either be a breakthrough in crisis coordination or a spectacular failure by an unauthorized civilian. Dr. Novak, this is Kris Luna at NATO Ramstein Coordination, she said into her headset, establishing the first critical link. I'm connected to Colonel Schmidt at German Emergency Coordination and Maria Kowalski at Polish Emergency Management. We're establishing real-time compatibility protocols for the Krakow response. Kris, I have Colonel Schmidt on the line, came Novak's voice from Prague. We're ready to coordinate modified evacuation priorities, but we need immediate confirmation of German medical facility protocols for petrochemical exposure treatment. This was it. The moment where her expertise would either solve the coordination crisis or prove that institutional skepticism about her capabilities had been correct. Around her, communication center personnel monitored multiple workstations, but she could feel their attention focused on her coordination attempt. Colonel Schmidt, Kris addressed the German coordinator directly. Czech evacuation teams are prioritizing cases based on UCBRN exposure categories, specifically petrochemical inhalation exposure with neurological symptom indicators. Can German medical facilities accommodate those cases using modified decontamination protocols? We can accommodate, but we need specific information about the chemical compounds involved, Schmidt replied in heavily accented English. Our standard chlorine-based decontamination may not be optimal for petrochemical contamination. Kris felt her training crystallize into practical application. Maria, what specific compounds are involved in the Krakow incident? We need exact chemical identification for German medical facilities to establish optimal treatment protocols. Benzene, toluene, and xylene from the processing facility, came Kowalski's voice from the Polish Coordination Center. Plus secondary compounds from combustion products. We're seeing respiratory distress combined with neurological symptoms in exposed populations. Colonel Schmidt, BTX petrochemical exposure requires alkaline wash protocols rather than chlorine-based decontamination, Kris said immediately. Czech emergency medical procedures use sodium bicarbonate solution for initial treatment, which is compatible with your medical facilities if you modify your intake protocols. Around her, she could hear murmurs of recognition from the communication center personnel. The technical coordination she was providing was solving real problems in real time, addressing compatibility issues that had been creating dangerous delays in medical treatment. Confirmed, Schmidt replied. We can modify protocols immediately. What evacuation priority should we prepare for? Dr. Novak, can you provide German medical facilities with priority categories for the next transport wave? Kris asked, orchestrating the three-way coordination with growing confidence. Priority 1, pediatric cases with respiratory distress. Priority 2, adult neurological symptom cases. Priority 3, elderly populations with cardiovascular complications from chemical exposure. Novak responded promptly. The coordination was working. Information was flowing between the three national systems. Protocols were being modified in real time, and the bottlenecks that had been creating dangerous delays were dissolving under the pressure of direct communication and expert translation between different emergency management systems. Maria, what's your evacuation route capacity for the next transport wave? Kris asked, managing the complex logistics coordination with practiced efficiency. We can clear primary evacuation routes for 60 casualties within 30 minutes if we have confirmed receiving facility protocols, Kowalski replied. Colonel Schmidt, can German medical facilities receive 60 casualties with modified BTX exposure protocols within the next 90 minutes? Kris asked. Confirmed, we're modifying our decontamination and treatment protocols now. Estimated readiness in 45 minutes. Major Coleman, who had been listening to the coordination with growing amazement, stepped forward. Dr. Novak, this is Major Patricia Coleman, NATO Ramstein Emergency Coordination. We're prepared to modify our transport scheduling to accommodate the revised priority protocols. What airlift capacity do you need? Major Coleman, we need medical transport capability for 60 priority cases, with specialized equipment for BTX exposure treatment, Novak replied. Kris has established exactly the coordination protocols we needed to make this work. Kris felt a surge of vindication and professional satisfaction. The expertise she'd developed through years of disaster relief coordination, the contacts she'd cultivated during international emergency exercises, and the knowledge she'd gained from studying cross-border emergency management systems had all converged into this moment of practical application. She was no longer tourist. Number 47 being dismissed as irrelevant to professional emergency response. She was the coordination specialist who had solved critical interface problems that had been delaying life-saving medical transport and evacuation procedures. Transport aircraft are being reconfigured for modified medical protocols, Coleman announced to her coordination team. Estimated departure in 60 minutes with optimized patient transport capabilities. Through her headset, Kris could hear the relief in voices from all three coordination centers as the bottlenecks dissolved and effective protocols were established. Czech evacuation teams could now prioritize cases using criteria that German medical facilities could accommodate. German hospitals could prepare treatment protocols optimized for the specific chemical exposures involved. Polish evacuation coordinators could schedule transport using NATO airlift capabilities that match their medical priority systems. Outstanding work, Coleman said quietly to Kris. This is exactly the type of coordination breakthrough we needed. Kris looked around the communication center at the personnel who had witnessed her unauthorized intervention become a crucial component of the personnel who had witnessed her unauthorized intervention, international emergency response. Her visitor badge was still tucked behind her back, but it no longer mattered. She had proven her expertise in the most dramatic way possible, by solving critical problems under pressure when lives hung in the balance. That the moment of truth had become a moment of transformation, not just for her role in the crisis response, but for how everyone around her understood what expertise looked like and where it could come from. At 5:17 p.m., as Kris coordinated the third wave of medical transports between Czech, German, and Polish emergency services, Staff Sergeant Brooks burst through the communication center entrance with security personnel in tow. "There she is," Brooks pointed directly at Kris, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Tourist number 47 from the base tour. She left the emergency shelter without authorization and somehow gained access to classified communication facilities." The coordination center fell silent except for the ongoing radio communications that Kris was managing through her headset. Major Coleman looked between Brooks and Kris with obvious confusion, while other personnel stopped their activities to observe what was clearly developing into a significant confrontation. "Ma'am, you need to step away from that workstation immediately," ordered Captain James Morrison, the security officer accompanying Brooks. "Unauthorized civilian access to military communication systems during active emergency operations is a serious security violation." Kris held up one finger while continuing her coordination conversation. Dr. Novak confirmed that the fourth transport wave can accommodate the modified triage protocols. "We need to maintain consistency with German receiving facility capabilities." "Specialist Luna, I said step away from the workstation now," Morrison repeated, his voice carrying clear command authority. "She's not a specialist," Brooks interjected sharply. "She's a tourist who was supposed to remain in the emergency shelter with the rest of the civilian tour group. I don't know how she gained access to this facility, but she's been impersonating emergency coordination personnel." Around them, communication center personnel watched the confrontation with growing fascination. Major Coleman looked particularly conflicted, clearly aware of the effective coordination work Kris had been performing, but also concerned about the security implications of unauthorized civilian access to military facilities. "Tourist?" asked Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of the coordination specialists who had been monitoring Kris's work. "She just established direct communication protocols between 3 national emergency systems and solved coordination problems that were delaying critical medical transports." "I don't care if she's coordinating with the Pope," Morrison replied firmly. "Unauthorized civilians cannot access classified communication systems during active military operations. The security protocols exist for critical reasons." Kris finished her current coordination task and turned to face the confrontation. Her expression calm despite the obvious seriousness of the situation. "Captain Morrison, I understand the security concerns, but there are 60 chemical exposure casualties being transported based on the coordination protocols I've established. Interrupting that coordination could delay medical treatment that's time-critical for neurological damage prevention." "Ma'am, your claimed expertise doesn't authorize you to violate base security and impersonate military personnel," Morrison replied. "You will step away from the workstation and accompany security personnel for questioning." Major Coleman stepped forward, clearly struggling with competing priorities. "Captain, the coordination work she's been doing has solved critical interface problems with allied emergency services. The transport efficiency has improved dramatically since she established these communication protocols." "Major, I understand the operational benefits," Morrison replied, "but we cannot overlook security violations just because unauthorized actions happen to produce positive results. If we allow civilians to bypass security protocols during emergencies, we compromise the entire base security framework." Brooks nodded emphatically. She lied to gain access to restricted areas, abandoned her designated safe location during an active emergency, and impersonated authorized personnel to access classified communication systems. The fact that she happens to know something about emergency coordination doesn't excuse those violations. Around them, other personnel continued managing various aspects of the crisis response, but the tension in the coordination center was palpable. The confrontation represented a fundamental conflict between rigid adherence to security protocols and pragmatic recognition of effective crisis management capability. Dr. Novak is standing by for confirmation of the next transport wave protocols, Lieutenant Chun reported quietly. The German and Polish coordinators are also waiting for continued coordination guidance. Kris looked at the communication workstation where 3 national emergency services were depending on her continued coordination, then at the security personnel who were clearly prepared to remove her from the facility, regardless of the operational consequences. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, "I accept full responsibility for violating security protocols. But before you remove me from this facility, please understand that interrupting the coordination I've established could delay medical transport for people who may suffer permanent neurological damage without immediate treatment." "Ma'am, that's not your decision to make," Morrison replied. "Emergency coordination is handled by authorized military and civilian personnel through established protocols. Your unauthorized intervention, regardless of its effectiveness, cannot be permitted to continue." The standoff crystallized around fundamental questions about authority, expertise, and the balance between security protocols and crisis management. Effectiveness. Kris had proven her capability in the most dramatic way possible, but she had also violated multiple regulations and security procedures in the process. Major Coleman looked at her radio, where all eyes were waiting for continued coordination, then at Kris, who had demonstrated expertise that was clearly valuable to the ongoing crisis response. The decision she was facing involved choosing between regulatory compliance and operational effectiveness. "Security protocols exist for critical reasons," Morrison continued, "but so do emergency coordination procedures. The question is whether we can find a way to maintain both security and operational effectiveness." The initial resistance was complete, institutional, and based on legitimate security concerns. But it was also blocking continued coordination that could save lives in Poland. Something had to give, and the decision would determine not just Kris's immediate future, but the effectiveness of the ongoing international emergency response. At 5:17 p.m., as Kris coordinated the third wave of medical transports between Czech, German, and Polish emergency services, Staff Sergeant Brooks burst through the communication center entrance with security personnel in tow. "There she is," Brooks pointed directly at Kris, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Tourist number 47 from the base tour. She left the emergency shelter without authorization and somehow gained access to classified communication facilities. The coordination center fell silent except for the ongoing radio communications that Kris was managing through her headset. Major Coleman looked between Brooks and Kris with obvious confusion, while other personnel stopped their activities to observe what was clearly developing into a significant confrontation. "Ma'am, you need to step away from that workstation immediately," ordered Captain James Morrison, the security officer accompanying Brooks. Unauthorized civilian access to military communication systems during active emergency operations is a serious security violation. Kris held up one finger while continuing her coordination conversation. Dr. Novak confirmed that the fourth transport wave can accommodate the modified triage protocols. We need to maintain consistency with German receiving facility capabilities. Specialist. "Luna, I said step away from the workstation now," Morrison repeated, his voice carrying clear command authority. "She's not a specialist," Brooks interjected sharply. "She's a tourist who is supposed to remain in the emergency shelter with the rest of the civilian tour group. I don't know how she gained access to this facility, but she's been impersonating emergency coordination personnel." Around them, communication center personnel watched the confrontation with growing fascination. Major Coleman looked particularly conflicted, clearly aware of the effective coordination work Kris had been performing, but also concerned about the security implications of unauthorized civilian access to military facilities. "Tourist?" asked Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of the coordination specialists who had been monitoring Kris's work. She just established direct communication protocols between 3 national emergency systems and solved coordination problems that were delaying critical medical transports. "I don't care if she's coordinating with the Pope," Morrison replied firmly. "Unauthorized civilians cannot access classified communication systems during active military operations. The security protocols exist for critical reasons." Kris finished her current coordination task and turned to face the confrontation, her expression calm despite the obvious seriousness of the situation. "Captain Morrison, I understand the security concerns, but there are 60 chemical exposure casualties being transported based on the coordination protocols I've established. Interrupting that coordination could delay medical treatment that's time-critical for neurological damage prevention." "Ma'am, your claimed expertise doesn't authorize you to violate base security and impersonate military personnel," Morrison replied. "You will step away from the workstation and accompany security personnel for questioning." Major Coleman stepped forward, clearly struggling with competing priorities. "Captain, the coordination work she's been doing has solved critical interface problems with allied emergency services. The transport efficiency has improved dramatically since she established these communication protocols." "Major, I understand the operational benefits," Morrison replied, "but we cannot overlook security violations just because unauthorized actions happen to produce positive results. If we allow civilians to bypass security protocols during emergencies, we compromise the entire base security framework." Brooks nodded emphatically. She lied to gain access to restricted areas, abandoned her designated safe location during an active emergency, and impersonated authorized personnel to access classified communication systems. The fact that she happens to know something about emergency coordination doesn't excuse those violations. Around them, other personnel continued managing various aspects of the crisis response, but the tension in the coordination center was palpable. The confrontation represented a fundamental conflict between rigid adherence to security protocols and pragmatic recognition of effective crisis management capability. Dr. Novak is standing by for confirmation of the next transport wave protocols, Lieutenant Chun reported quietly. The German and Polish coordinators are also waiting for continued coordination guidance. Kris looked at the communication workstation where 3 national Emergency services were depending on her continued coordination. Then at the security personnel who were clearly prepared to remove her from the facility, regardless of the operational consequences. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, "I accept full responsibility for violating security protocols. But before you remove me from this facility, please understand that interrupting the coordination I've established could delay medical transport for people who may suffer permanent neurological damage without immediate treatment." "Ma'am, that's not your decision to make," Morrison replied. "Emergency coordination is handled by authorized military and civilian personnel through established protocols. Your unauthorized intervention, regardless of its effectiveness, cannot be permitted to continue." The standoff crystallized around fundamental questions about authority, expertise, and the balance between security protocols and crisis management. Effectiveness. Kris had proven her capability in the most dramatic way possible, but she had also violated multiple regulations and security procedures in the process. Major Coleman looked at her radio, where all eyes were waiting for continued coordination, then at Kris, who had demonstrated expertise that was clearly valuable to the ongoing crisis response. The decision she was facing involved choosing between regulatory compliance and operational effectiveness. "Security protocols exist for critical reasons," Morrison continued, "but so do emergency coordination procedures. The question is whether we can find a way to maintain both security and operational effectiveness." The initial resistance was complete, institutional, and based on legitimate security concerns. But it was also blocking continued coordination that could save lives in Poland. Something had to give, and the decision would determine not just Kris's immediate future, but the effectiveness of the ongoing international emergency response. At 5:31 p.m., the communication center doors opened to admit two figures whose presence immediately changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Brigadier General Robert Hayes, Ramstein's base commander, entered accompanied by Colonel Patricia Webb from NATO Emergency Coordination Command. The tension in the room shifted from operational disagreement to career-defining moment as everyone present realized that decisions made in the next few minutes would have consequences far beyond the immediate crisis. "Major Coleman, General," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. "I understand we have a situation that requires immediate resolution." "Sir," Coleman replied, standing at attention, "we have an unauthorized civilian who has been conducting highly effective emergency coordination with allied services, but who gained access through security protocol violations." Hayes looked at Kris, still seated at the communication workstation with her headset around her neck, then at Captain Morrison and the security personnel who had been preparing to remove her from the facility. The silence stretched as he evaluated the situation with the practiced assessment of a career military officer. "Miss Luna," Hayes said finally, using her name in a way that suggested he'd been briefed on the situation. "I understand you've been coordinating international emergency response without proper authorization." "Yes, sir," Kris replied, standing and facing him directly. "I violated base security protocols to access communication systems during an active emergency operation. And in doing so, you've established coordination protocols that have improved medical transport efficiency by approximately 40%. According to the reports I've received," Hayes continued, "you've solved interface problems between three national emergency systems that our standard coordination procedures couldn't address. Around them, communication center personnel continued managing various aspects of the crisis response, but everyone was acutely aware of the confrontation unfolding. The decision Hayes was contemplating would establish precedent for how the military balanced security protocols against operational effectiveness during international emergencies." "Sir," Captain Morrison interjected, "regardless of operational benefits, we cannot overlook security violations that compromise base security frameworks." If we allow unauthorized civilians to bypass protocols during emergencies, we establish dangerous precedents. Captain Morrison raises valid security concerns, Hayes acknowledged. Colonel Webb, what's your assessment of the coordination effectiveness we've gained through Miss Luna's unauthorized intervention? Webb, who had been observing the situation with the analytical focus of someone experienced in complex international operations, stepped forward. General, the coordination protocols she's established have solved critical compatibility issues between Czech EUCBRN classification systems and NATO medical transport procedures. The interface she's created between German medical facilities and Polish evacuation coordinators has eliminated bottlenecks that were creating dangerous delays. And the security implications? Hayes asked. Significant, Webb replied honestly. Unauthorized civilian access to classified communication systems during active operations represents a serious breach of established protocols. However, the operational benefits have been substantial and potentially life-saving. Hayes looked at Kris with the measured assessment of someone evaluating both capability and character under pressure. Miss Luna, help me understand your background and qualifications for the coordination work you've been performing. Kris took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would determine not just her immediate future, but potentially her entire career. In emergency management. Sir, I'm a consultant with the Czech Emergency Management Agency, specializing in cross-border disaster coordination. I've managed evacuations for over 15,000 people during the Central European floods, and I've worked with EU task forces on international emergency response protocols. And you felt authorized to bypass our security procedures and establish unauthorized coordination channels based on that background? Hayes asked. No, sir, Kris replied quietly. I felt morally obligated to prevent coordination failures that could cost lives when I had the knowledge and contacts necessary to solve those problems. I understood the security violations I was committing, but I chose to prioritize operational effectiveness over regulatory compliance. The communication center fell silent except for ongoing radio traffic. Hayes studied her with the focus of someone making a decision that would affect not just this crisis, but future emergency response protocols. Dr. František Novak from Czech Emergency Management is requesting immediate continuation of coordination protocols, Lieutenant Chun reported. Quietly, German and Polish coordinators are also standing by for continued guidance. Hayes looked at the communication workstation where 3 national emergency services were depending on continued coordination, then at Kris, who had demonstrated expertise that was clearly crucial to the ongoing response. Miss Luna, he said finally, your actions represent both exemplary crisis management capability and serious security protocol violations. The question we're facing is whether exceptional circumstances justify exceptional responses. Sir, Kris replied, I accept full responsibility for my actions and their consequences. But if those actions have saved lives in Poland, I would make the same choice again. Hayes exchanged glances with Colonel Webb, some form of silent communication passing between them. The decision they were contemplating would balance security concerns against operational effectiveness, institutional protocol against individual initiative. Captain Morrison, Hayes said, what would be required to provide Miss Luna with appropriate authorization to continue her coordination work? Morrison looked surprised but responded professionally. Emergency authorization could be established through NATO protocols for civilian specialists during active operations. It would require documentation of her qualifications and security clearance procedures. Colonel Webb, can that authorization be expedited given the operational requirements? Hayes asked. Yes, sir. Emergency protocols allow for rapid authorization when civilian expertise is crucial to active operations. Hayes looked at Kris one final time. Miss Luna, are you prepared to accept formal authorization to continue your coordination work under NATO emergency protocols? Kris felt a surge of vindication and professional recognition. Yes, sir. Then let's make this official. At 6:15 p.m., Kris Luna sat at the same communication workstation. But everything had changed. The visitor badge that had marked her as an outsider was replaced by a temporary NATO emergency coordination credential. The security personnel who had been prepared to remove her from the facility now provided additional support for her expanded coordination activities. Most significantly, the dismissive attitudes that had characterized her treatment throughout the day had been replaced by genuine professional respect. Dr. Novak, this is Kris Luna, now operating under NATO emergency authorization. She said into her headset, her voice carrying new confidence. We're expanding coordination protocols to include Slovak emergency services for overflow medical transport capacity. Around her, communication center personnel who had witnessed her transformation from unauthorized tourist to officially recognized coordinator worked to support her expanded activities. Major Coleman, who had taken the initial risk of allowing her to demonstrate her capabilities, now served as her military liaison for NATO coordination procedures. Miss Luna, General Hayes approached her workstation. I've received commendation reports from Czech, German, and Polish emergency coordination centers. They're requesting that your coordination protocols be established as standard procedures for future multinational emergency responses. The recognition was comprehensive and institutional. Not only had her individual capabilities been acknowledged, but her methods were being adopted as improved standard procedures for international crisis coordination. The expertise that had been dismissed as irrelevant tourist interest was now being recognized as cutting-edge emergency management capability. Colonel Webb has authorization to offer you a consulting position with NATO Emergency Coordination Command. Hayes continued. Your expertise in cross-border emergency response appears to be exactly what we need for improved international crisis management. Kris looked around the communication center where she was now managing coordination between 4 national emergency systems, where personnel sought her guidance on protocol compatibility issues, where her expertise had transformed from invisible to essential. General, I'm honored by the recognition, she replied. But my primary concern right now is ensuring that the Krakow response continues effectively. Which brings me to my next point, Hayes said with what might have been the hint of a smile. We're establishing you as lead coordinator for the international response expansion. Slovak and Austrian emergency services are requesting integration into the coordination protocols you've developed. Lead coordinator. From tourist number 47 to lead coordinator of an international emergency response in less than 4 hours. The transformation was so complete that it felt surreal, but the expertise that made it possible had always been real. Lieutenant Chen approached with updated casualty reports. Ma'am, the medical transport efficiency improvements have reduced evacuation times by an average of 57 minutes per patient. The German medical facilities report that early intervention based on your modified protocols has prevented neurological damage in approximately 30 cases. 30 cases. 30 people who would recover fully because coordination delays had been eliminated, because interface problems had been solved, because someone had been willing to bypass institutional limitations to provide necessary expertise. The Polish Coordination Center is reporting that evacuation operations are ahead of schedule, Chun continued. Czech emergency services have requested that your coordination protocols be shared with other EU emergency management agencies. Staff Sergeant Brooks appeared at the edge of the coordination area, her expression a mixture of amazement and what might have been embarrassment. Throughout the day, she had been the voice of institutional limitation, the person who had consistently dismissed Kris's expertise based on her tourist status. Miss Luna, Brooks said quietly, I owe you an apology. I failed to recognize your qualifications and expertise because I was focused on protocols rather than capabilities. Kris looked at Brooks with understanding rather than resentment. "Sergeant, you were following established procedures designed to maintain security and order. The problem wasn't your adherence to protocols, it was that the protocols weren't designed to recognize expertise that came from unexpected sources." Around them, the communication center continued managing the expanded international coordination. But there was a different quality to the activity. Personnel moved with increased efficiency. Coordination flowed more smoothly between agencies, and the crisis response had evolved from a series of separate national efforts to a truly integrated international operation. "What you've accomplished today," General Hayes said, reviewing coordination reports, "represents a fundamental improvement in how we approach international emergency response. Your methods are being studied for integration into standard NATO coordination procedures." Colonel Webb joined the conversation, carrying documentation that formalized Kris's new status. "Miss Luna, your emergency authorization has been extended indefinitely. NATO Emergency Coordination Command would like to offer you a permanent consulting position developing improved international response protocols." The offer represented complete professional recognition, validation of expertise that had been invisible just hours earlier. From being dismissed as an irrelevant tourist to being recruited by NATO for permanent coordination responsibilities. "I'm interested," Kris replied, "but I want to ensure that the protocols we develop are designed to recognize expertise regardless of its source. Too many qualified people are overlooked because they don't fit institutional expectations about what expertise looks like." "Agreed," Webb said. "That's exactly the kind of perspective we need for improved emergency response systems." As the afternoon shifted toward evening, Kris continued coordinating the international response, but now she did so with full institutional support, professional recognition, and the knowledge that her expertise was not only valued, but would be used to improve future emergency response capabilities. The transformation was complete. Tourist number 47 had become lead international coordination specialist Luna, and her methods were becoming the new standard for multinational emergency response. But more importantly, she had proven that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources and that institutional limitations could be overcome when lives were at stake. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.